I have the honor tonight of introducing Mr. David Satter, a former Moscow correspondent of the Financial Times of London. He has written 3 books on Russia, and his first book, Age of Delirium, he turned into a documentary, which he showed to students on Tuesday. He has followed Russian events for almost 4 decades. After Radio Liberty accredited Satter as a correspondent in Moscow, he was expelled from Russia, becoming the first U.S. correspondent to be expelled since the Cold War. He is a fellow of the Foreign Policy Institute at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, a senior fellow of the Hudson Institute, and a senior fellow of the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. He has also been a research fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Satter teaches a course on Russian politics and history at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced Academic Programs and has been a visiting professor at the University of Illinois. This week, my classmates and I have had the privilege of learning from him about nonfiction writing and how he went from being a police reporter in Chicago to a foreign correspondent in the Soviet Union because he always finished what he started. Russia may not want him, but he is more than welcome here at Hillsdale College. Please join me in welcoming Mr. David Satter.
Well, Natalie's introduction is a good example of why it's such a pleasure to be at Hillsdale, because I have exceptionally charming students and students also who are very interested in learning. I have returned to the United States from London, which is where I'm living at the present time. I decided once I was expelled from Russia, I almost said the Soviet Union, because it was much more in the character of the Soviet Union to expel correspondents than in the character of post-Soviet Russia. Russia claimed to be beyond all that. In fact, it was a point of pride that not a single American correspondent had been expelled from Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union. There were times, in fact, when Russian officials even pointed to me as an example of just how tolerant they were. But unfortunately for me, their tolerance finally broke, and I was expelled from Russia in December of last year. The way this happened was actually Kafkaesque. I left Moscow and went to Kyiv in order to renew my visa. I had only been in Russia for 3 months. I could not have actually done something during that period that would have justified expulsion, because during that 3-month period, it was all I could do to organize an apartment, open a banking account, and get furniture, to get set up to work. I actually wrote very little during that period. I think that the reason I was expelled was because the authorities were concerned about what I might do in the future, not over what I had done since arriving in September. Incidentally, in this regard, I was, at the same time that the Russians were banning me, they were welcoming Edward Snowden, the NSA leaker. And I did have one amusing moment, actually 2 amusing moments. I'll start with the first one. Snowden was claimed in various interviews that he had no contact with Russian intelligence. This claim intrigued me, because here I was, a person with years of experience in Russia and the Soviet Union, a fluent Russian speaker, and it took me months to get through all the bureaucracy, with a valid passport and a valid visa, and it took me months to get through all of the bureaucracy in order to establish residency in Moscow. I wondered how it was possible for Snowden, with no valid passport, no visa, no status, no knowledge of Russia, and no knowledge of Russian, to get through all of this without help. And in fact, he did have help. He just assumed for some reason that the nice people who were helping him had no connection to Russian intelligence, which given the practices of Russia and the Soviet Union is really the height of naivete on the part of someone who was so clever about betraying the trust of those who relied on him to behave in a manner that took into regard the welfare and security of the entire country. The other thing, of course, was that after I was expelled, the Iranian news agency, Pars, printed a story claiming that the reason I was expelled was because I was organizing an effort to kill Snowden. And after this appeared, and this did appear, it's on the internet, you can find it if you do a search, people began to ask me, is it true you were trying to kill Snowden? And in fact, I had no desire to kill him, and in fact, I even feel that would be the worst thing that could happen, that he really needs to be returned to the U.S. For questioning. But in any case, I decided that discretion in this matter was the better part of valor. The Iranians are just crazy enough to believe their own inventions, so I just did not comment on that at all. When I left Moscow to renew my visa in the Russian embassy in Kyiv. This in itself was routine. I had to extend it for the next year. What wasn't routine was what happened next. In the embassy, I handed in the number of the telex sent by the Russian Foreign Ministry, which was attached to the visa approval letter. This is a standard bureaucratic procedure. Once they have the number of the telex, they retrieve the attached letter and process the visa, which is then stamped in your passport. I know this because I've gone through this procedure many times. Went to the embassy and waited in line. I handed in the number and handed in my completed application. And the consular officer went to get the letter. And I was sitting there for more than an hour. He finally came back and he said, I'm sorry, there's no letter attached to this number. I said, well, what are you talking about? He said, there has to be a letter attached to the number. They don't give the number without a letter. And he said, that's true. And I said, well, he said, tell me, how long have you worked in the consular service? And he said, 21 years. I said, in those 21 years, have you ever had a case where there was no letter attached to the approval telex? He said, no, it's the first time. So I called the Russian Foreign Ministry from Kyiv. I asked them what's going on, and they said, don't worry about a thing. Everything is taken care of. Go back tomorrow. There's a diplomat who will explain the whole situation, solve this problem. It's just those bureaucrats, in the embassy in Kyiv. They can't do anything right. So I assume maybe that was the case. And I went back the next day, and I called up to the diplomat in question, and he said, I'd like to read you something. I have a statement to read to you. I realized that was not good news. And he said that the competent organs, which is the expression in Russia for the FSB, the security police, have determined that your presence on the territory of the Russian Federation is undesirable and you're banned from entering Russia. And with that, I became the first person to be declared persona non grata, the first American journalist to be declared persona non grata in Russia since the Cold War. Now, In fact, this seemingly isolated incident was not as isolated as it appeared. It reflected a change in policy, because after all, I'd been getting visas despite the fact that I had written many things that were undesirable from the point of view of the authorities. And it had definitely been Russian policy to create the impression, or to seek to create the impression, that Russia was a democratic country, that it was a country that could be trusted by the West, that it didn't do things like expel foreign correspondents. But suddenly something happened. There was some type of sea change that made that policy too risky in the eyes of the Russian leaders. And not long after I was expelled, a whole slew of other steps were taken to crack down on Russian human rights organizations, foreigners working in Moscow, and persons taking part in protests. Suddenly, Russia became a more repressive place, even in comparison to the way it was previously. And I think the reason for that change was not something that happened in Russia, but on the contrary, the events in neighboring Ukraine. Now, all of the former Soviet republics, with the partial exception of the Baltic republics, have certain things in common. They all were subjected to the kind of spiritual sterilization and imposed mass conformity that was obligatory under the Soviet regime. Soviet regime did not recognize the value of an individual. Individual was, as a matter of doctrine, subordinated to the collective and subordinated to the society. His interests were not important. What was important was the degree to which he could serve the state. Stalin, in a famous toast after the end of the Second World War, made this point explicitly. He said he wanted to salute the great Russian people who played the greatest part in the victory over Nazism, each of them a cog in the great machine of the state. And in fact, that attitude toward the individual was displayed in many, many other situations, including, by the way, during the war, in the way in which the lives of Soviet soldiers were wasted. The Germans lost roughly 1/3 as many soldiers as the Soviets, even in battles in which they lost to the Soviets. The lives of this was in fact one of the reasons why the Soviet Union won, because it was so profligate with the lives of its soldiers. But in any case, this kind of degradation of the individual and disregard for the value of the individual has an effect on the moral fiber of society. Because after all, the sense of right and wrong is the quality of an individual. And throughout the former Soviet Union, in Russia, in Ukraine, in Kyrgyzstan, in Uzbekistan, in Azerbaijan, with the fall of the Soviet Union, the pattern was the same. Yes, there was a change from a socialist economy to a capitalist economy. A state which was based on complete state ownership was succeeded by a state in which there was private ownership. But there was no underlying moral change. And as a result, what happened was an epidemic of thievery and gangsterism. And so what emerged from the wreckage of the Soviet Union was not a set of democratic states poised to develop genuine and reliable legal institutions, but on the contrary, a set of kleptocracies in which a small group of people pillaged the country for their own benefit and to the great detriment of the rest of the population. This pattern was particularly obvious in Russia and Ukraine. What was known as privatization in Russia was actually a process of mass thievery, because all of the state's property was in the hands of impoverished bureaucrats, and there were very few people who had the experience of operating in a normal market economy. Under those circumstances, property passed into the hands of those who controlled it under the old regime, or those who had corrupt connections. It became indispensable in Russia and in Ukraine to pay bribes, and the cost of the bribe was considered the starting capital for the enterprise. By buying an official, you could buy permission, for example, to export oil, which you purchased at the domestic price, which was 1% of the world price, and then sell it at the world price. The same applied for many other raw materials. With the help of bribes, you could induce the government to deposit, for example, the funds of the state customs service in your bank. And instead of paying salaries, you could lend the money out short term at astronomical rates of interest, while the people who needed that money in order to pay their bills and survive waited months or even years to be paid. This was how the new moneyed class was created in Russia. It was the way it was created in Ukraine. But a system that's based on thievery cannot convince the people who live under it of its legitimacy. Everyone was a witness to how these fortunes were created. These countries were driven into poverty, but a small group of multi-billionaires was created whose lifestyles and values angered everyone else. The long-range consequences of this were that the property that was acquired in this manner was nowhere regarded as legitimate, and the lack of legal institutions that made it possible to seize property in this way invited a new round of stealing, and that's exactly what took place. In Russia, it began in 2003 with the arrest of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the richest person in Russia at the time, the head of the Yukos oil company. He was arrested because of his attempts, first of all, to change the conditions of Russian capitalism, although when it came to accumulating wealth, he was no different than anyone else. He was nonetheless alone among the oligarchs in Russia, among those who had huge fortunes, in understanding that the rules of bandit capitalism were disadvantageous in the long run. And he made a transition from bandit capitalist to Western-style manager and oil company owner. His company, Yukos, began to publish all of their results and all of their finances. They subjected themselves to Western standards of accounting, and they soon were listed on the New York Stock Exchange. And in fact, with the rise in oil prices, the value of that company, which was run according to Western principles, was rose astronomically. The value, I think, if I'm not wrong, increased something like 7 or 8 times. In any case, Khodorkovsky took another step, which would have been perfectly normal in the West, which is he began supporting opposition political parties, and particularly those who could be relied on to support legislation and programs that were favorable to UKAS. This was really too much for the Putin leadership. And Khodorkovsky was arrested. He was charged in connection with violations that took place earlier in the 1990s, violations that in fact were no different than those committed by everyone else in Russia with large fortunes. And he was sent to Siberia and became a prisoner for the next 10 years. His oil company was divided up among Putin's cronies, and thus began the second wave of thievery in Russia, the second wave of privatization. This time, forcible privatization, which was given the name of raiding, and began to sweep the country. People saw how easy it was to steal someone's oil company, and officials at all levels simply copied the example of the officials at the top. If Khodorkovsky was the wealthiest person in Russia, and if it was Putin and his entourage that took away his oil company, well, the same process took place at the regional level, at the local level, at the level of a given town. In the West, when we talk about corporate raiding, we're talking about a process which results in a more efficient distribution of resources and in which both sides benefit. Raiding in Russia, although it has the same name, is completely different. In the case of Russia, what took place was this use of the organs of law enforcement to seize someone's property. This was done in a very simple way. Usually, a minority shareholder was infiltrated into the board of directors of a company, who then brought charges, usually in some distant jurisdiction, of malfeasance. With the help of a corrupt judge, a court decision was issued, and the cost of the court decision is the most expensive part of carrying out the raid. At that point, with the illegitimate court decision in hand, the raider returns to the company he wants to take over, rents the local police, and simply appropriates the given factory or enterprise. That began to happen all over Russia. At the same time, in neighboring Ukraine, the process ripened, but did not occur because, as a result of what was called the Orange Revolution in 2004, Ukraine, unlike Russia, is a regionally divided country in which a large part of the country, up until the Second World War, was European, was part of Poland. And this part of the Ukraine, the Western Ukraine, is Western in its orientation and Ukrainian nationalist, and definitely determined to defend the national integrity of Ukraine. Whereas in the eastern part of the country, there are many Russians, ethnic Russians, who were settled there, especially after the 1932-1933 artificial famine in which millions of people died. As a result of this split in the country, there was real competitive voting in Ukraine. And in 2004, Viktor Yanukovych was elected president on the basis of massive falsification of the results of the election. This triggered a huge protest in Kyiv, which became known as the Orange Revolution, and The crisis which resulted was resolved when Viktor Yushchenko, the unsuccessful candidate, was elected in a re-election. Yushchenko's period in office was one of the reasons why the process of reprivatization, the process that took place in Russia after the arrest of Khodorkovsky, was delayed by a number of years. But Yushchenko had the bad luck of being president of Ukraine during the world economic crisis of 2007 to 2009. During that period, Ukraine's gross national product fell by 15%. It suffered perhaps more than any other post-Soviet state from the consequences of the economic crisis. Industrial production fell 30%. And in the aftermath of this economic disaster, from which Ukraine began to recover but has not recovered fully, Yanukovych, despite his record of having falsified the results of the 2004 election, in 2010 was elected president. Yanukovych had an interesting history. He began as a petty criminal in the Donetsk Oblast, and he became aligned with a man named Rinat Akhmetov, who worked as an enforcer for a local gangster named Bragin, who was blown up along with 6 of his bodyguards in a crime in which Akhmetov was widely suspected. In any case, in the aftermath of Bragin's death, Akhmetov took over much of his holdings in the eastern Ukraine and eventually became the richest man in Ukraine. His protege and his political protege was none other than Yanukovych. And Yanukovych, when he became president of Ukraine in 2010, brought with him the methods and psychology of the Donetsk underworld. If in other parts of the country privatization was crooked, in the Donetsk Oblast it was bloody and carried out with the help of massacres and contract killings on a very large scale. As President Yanukovych began the process, which was also taking place in Russia, but in perhaps a less focused form, of bringing the country's property into his own hands. He did this by, first of all, packing the Constitutional Court with the help of deputies who were financially dependent on the government, using the new Constitutional Court to change the structure of the country from presidential parliamentary. It had been changed to that from presidential by Yushchenko, changed it back to presidential, and he then, using again his influence with the courts, adopted a series of laws that deprived not only ordinary citizens, but members of the parliament of the protection of the law. And what happened next was simply extortion and expropriation of property on the scale of the whole country. People were given an offer for their property, which was, or for their enterprises, which was far below their true value. And if they refused to accept it, they received a lower offer. And if they refused to accept that, they were brought to court or imprisoned. In the course of 3 years, Yanukovych's son, Alexander, a dentist, became one of the wealthiest people in Ukraine, a multi-billionaire. When Yanukovych was asked how it was possible to amass such wealth in 3 years, Yanukovych said he's a very gifted businessman. In fact, the reputation of Yanukovych, his family, and their henchmen was such that many people began expropriating property at the local level, simply saying, "I'm from Alexander." No one bothered to check those claims because they were perfectly feasible. But this concentrated and widespread seizure of property was only possible because of the corruption of the system of law enforcement. And that had other consequences. In the town of Veryavka, the first sign of popular discontent appeared. A young girl was kidnapped, raped, and almost beaten to death by two members of the local police. And then the crime was covered up by higher-ups in the city. This finally was too much because there had been two similar murders in the last 3 years in the same town. And people began to protest and tried to take over the police building. Later, they marched on Kyiv and demonstrated in the Maidan, which was Maidan is the Ukrainian word for square, Maidan Nezalezhnosti, Independence Square, where the later demonstrations took place. This was a sign of the fact that the population had finally had enough. And it was also an indication of just how out of control the police and law enforcement were. Because this was not the only case of a woman being raped. There were cases of women being beaten, raped, murdered, either by members of law enforcement or by persons connected to the authorities. The situation had reached the point in Ukraine where no one felt safe. No one felt that they had a business that they could be sure that they could continue to own and run. There was no security of property, and perhaps more important, there was no sense that they would be protected in their personal lives. Anyone dragged into a police station on any pretext had no defense whatsoever. And all of this was rooted in the lawless system that was created by privatization initially, but greatly increased and strengthened under Yanukovych. So therefore, when Yanukovych announced in November 2013 that after having promised to sign an association agreement with the European Union, that Ukraine was not, in fact, going to join Europe, and when he did so without giving any explanation or promising anything further in the way of ongoing negotiations, demonstrations took place in Kyiv, which were greatly exacerbated when the police attacked a group of students in the Maidan Square and savagely beat them, even though they were peaceful and demonstrating only for Ukraine's adherence to the association agreement which Yanukovych himself had promised. That was the beginning of the nationwide revolt that led to the overthrow of Yanukovych. That was the Ukrainian anti-criminal revolution. I was there in December, and in addition to applying for my visa, I kept a diary. Some of my entries appeared on National Review Online, about what was going on in Ukraine at that time. The main square in the center of the city was turned into a medieval fortress in which a completely self-contained city, which provided, which had its own sentinels, its own guards, its own system of security, its own food service, its own hospital, even its own prayer rooms, and its lectures and movie hall. And I should add that my movie was shown in the Maidan on Christmas Eve. overthrow of Yanukovych was followed, as we know, by the seizure of Crimea by Russia and by the invasion of eastern Ukraine, which was accompanied by a whole series of atrocities, including, of course, the shooting down of Malaysian airliner 17 over eastern Ukraine. It is a testimony to the complete disregard of the individual in Russia that the Russians could have given the Buk anti-aircraft system to a collection of terrorists like that. Terrorists were under pressure from the Ukrainian Air Force. They themselves did not have planes. But the area over eastern Ukraine is one of the busiest air traffic routes in the world. And these systems have a friend or foe program, which identifies whether a potential target is a friend or a foe. And they are hooked into the nationwide aircraft monitoring system. But they only work within the boundaries of the country for which they're designated. So to take a Russian anti-aircraft system and move it to Ukraine, and then put it in the hands of terrorists, or even if it was professional Russian soldiers who were operating it, nonetheless meant that you were accepting the idea that any shot fired from that system could bring down a civilian airliner, which is exactly what happened. In addition to the shooting down of MH17, there was indiscriminate shelling and indiscriminate beatings and torture of ordinary civilians. Now, it must be pointed out, in fact, that the Russians were not the only ones, the Russian separatist forces for whom weapons were pouring in over the border, were not the only ones engaging in indiscriminate shelling. The Ukrainians are also former Soviet citizens, and there was indiscriminate shelling from the Ukrainian side too. But in a matter of a couple of weeks, at least 3,000 people, overwhelmingly civilians, were dead. There is now a ceasefire, so-called, in place, although a bitter fight is continuing for the Donetsk airport in eastern Ukraine. But the fighting can break out again at any minute, and it's already served its purpose, which is to destabilize the new government of Ukraine, which is seeking to align itself with the West. There have been various theories that have been advanced by Western specialists and by various observers as to why Russia did this. Why would Russia, which is a kindred nation to Ukraine, where people have Ukrainian relatives, where many people are of Ukrainian descent, why would it initiate a civil war between people who are so similar and provoke such a bloodbath? And some have said, well, it's because Putin is trying to reestablish the Soviet Union. Others have said that Putin wants to be a new Napoleon or a new Stalin. Some people have suggested that Putin wants to take over all of Ukraine. But the reality, I think, is different. I think what's at stake here is a desire to make sure that the Russian people do not follow the Ukrainian example. The example of a peaceful, spontaneous, self-organizing, self-regulating, anti-criminal revolution in Ukraine that succeeded in overthrowing a criminal clique that was in charge of the country is exactly the example that the Russian leaders don't want the Russian people to see and to take seriously. And yet the reason is that the conditions in Russia are really the same. Yes, it's true that Ukraine is smaller, that the abuses of Yanukovych and his family were more visible than those of Putin and his clique, although not that much more visible. It's also true that Ukraine is poorer because Russia has natural resources. But the basic imprint of a kleptocratic regime which has no regard, which exists only to feed itself with complete disregard for the interests of the country, that condition is the same. And in fact, it exists in the other former Soviet republics as well. And so Putin has turned to the tried and true method of distracting the attention of the population, which is to start a war. And by the way, this is nothing new. In 1994, Yeltsin, facing increasing unpopularity because of the economic reforms in Russia, started the first Chechen War. 1999, to bring Putin to power, he started the Second Chechen War. 2008, to boost the status of his place warmer, Dmitry Medvedev, who took over as president for one term, started the war against Georgia. And now, in order to distract the population from the anti-criminal revolution in Ukraine, they started this new war. The difficulty is that starting a war is a very unpredictable enterprise, and it's full of risk. It is true that now Putin's popularity rating is astronomical. But the Tsar experienced the same thing at the beginning of the First World War in 1914. 3 years later, he was deposed. The situation in Russia is basically dysfunctional, just as it was in Ukraine. And it's dysfunctional because it's a country without law, and it's a country with warped values. Now, only a restoration of decent values and the rule of law holds the possibility of curing the endemic problems in Russia that are eventually going to lead to a systemic crisis. And no amount of artificial chauvinism, artificially induced chauvinism or militarism is going to change the course of history in the long run. So I think that we now face a country which is a challenge to the United States. Russia has shown that it's willing to tear up the post-war consensus and for the first time seize territory of another country, a country with which it had literally 250 treaties, all of which were based either directly or indirectly on acknowledgement of Ukraine's territorial sovereignty and integrity. Russia's shown that it has no respect for truth and it is engaging in massive falsification, all of it directed against both the Ukrainians and the US, which, despite our naive policy of reset, is considered to be the evil force behind the Ukrainians and the inspiration for their revolt. In order to deal with this situation, we have to bear in mind that anything based on falsehood to this degree is going to be unstable. And Russia is a country with nuclear weapons. Russia's the second most powerful nuclear state, as we know, and its military resources are formidable. If the situation inside Russia begins to unravel as a result of people understanding what the people in Ukraine began to understand, that they're being dominated by a criminal clique, and that clique acts only in its own interests and not in the interests of the country, there could begin to be serious unrest in Russia. And serious unrest in Russia threatens not just the stability of Russia, but because Russia is so powerful, it threatens the whole world. In conclusion, I'd like to say that and I think it's appropriate to say this here at Hillsdale, where individual rights and the importance of the individual and his freedom is understood and taken seriously, that our greatest gift right now to the Russian people under these circumstances is our American moral influence, the influence of a society in which, despite everything, there is the rule of law, and the individual is taken seriously and can't just be trampled underfoot and treated as raw material for the realization of the aims of the political leaders. It's going to be one of the challenges of the American political system, and it's important to keep this in mind as we look ahead to the next presidential election, to find ways to insist on that our government understand the real issues that are at stake, and to use that influence in ways that can be effective. We owe that to the Russian people, who are going to need the help of the outside world. And I think in terms of our long-term security, we owe it to ourselves. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Satter, for your talk. We will now have some time for questions and answers. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and we will bring you the microphone.
Thank you, Mr. Satter. Viktor Yushchenko, was that the leader that was poisoned with polonium and his face was horribly disfigured prior to the Orange Revolution?
Yeah, he was poisoned with dioxin, but yeah, yes.
Was that the KGB that did it, or
well, this is, it's one of the ironies of this situation that after Yushchenko was elected, he was very lethargic about uncovering exactly who was responsible. But people who are familiar with the situation, and particularly the high degree of expertise that the KGB always had when it came to poisoning people, believed that it was Russian intelligence that was responsible. It may well be that he feared that if he pursued it too energetically, they might finish the job.
Thank you for that excellent presentation. I've been hearing a lot in both regular media and alternative media about the unpegging of the US dollar from oil and the trade agreements between China and Russia exchanging goods and resources in their own currencies and not using the US dollar. And my question for you is, can you share your insight and what you understand about the economics of the situation as to what the global war of fiat currencies is right now between the Western central banking system and what's going on in Eurasia with China and Russia, and also maybe even some of the challenges with the Middle East and attempts to go on to gold standard in Africa, and how all these things are affecting what we hear in the news about wars and unrest in the Middle East and that type of thing. So I just would love to get your insight on that.
I'm not sure I have much insight. I think that, it's clear the Russians have spoken before about their desire to lessen their dependence on the dollar, and in light of the sanctions that have been imposed on the Russian economy, they may very well be considering those options seriously. America's great reserve weapon is its influence over the world banking system. If we decide to go further in the way of sanctions, the U.S. has the ability really to paralyze the Russian financial system. And it may well be with that potential in mind that Russia is beginning to consider these alternatives. There.
Back here. You talked about the need for some sort of moral regeneration in Russian society. Could you comment on the state of the Russian Orthodox Church and its place in society since Vladimir Putin has taken power?
Thanks for that question. This is something that is always asked because Putin regularly surrounds himself with the hierarchs of the Russian Orthodox Church. One would get the impression, if one watched nothing but Russian television, that Putin was one of the most pious and deeply religious people in the world. He doesn't take a move. He doesn't make a move without having a Russian Orthodox a priest dressed in full religious regalia at his side. He attends all religious services for all religious holidays. Make sure that he's photographed. But the Russian Orthodox Church itself, at least if we talk about its hierarchy, is deeply corrupt. I'll give you an example. During the 1990s, the Russian Orthodox Church was given a concession. They were allowed the right to import alcohol and tobacco without paying customs duties, and then they, of course, sold the alcohol, tobacco, made huge fortunes, and a lot of the leading church hierarchs became very, very rich, despite the fact that smoking in the Russian Orthodox Church is considered to be a sin. Not only there was a sign of just how rich they became when Kirill, who is the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, was photographed with a $30,000 watch. And that photograph was photoshopped by the patriarchy to remove the watch, the watch from his wrist. But they forgot to remove the reflection of the watch from the polished table where he was sitting. So it was obvious not only that he had the watch, but was trying to conceal the watch. There are thousands of ordinary Russian Orthodox priests who really play a positive role in the country and who help people a lot and are really a source of comfort and solace and bring some spirituality and religiosity to people in Russia. But the Russian Orthodox hierarchy, but those people, the ordinary priests are very unworldly. They don't have much to do with politics. The hierarchy, however, which is firmly connected to the regime, is totally corrupt, ignores all real moral issues, and focuses on the gay issue. Now, they have not denounced Russian corruption. They've not opposed the killing of civilians, even when those civilians were Russians, as, for example, during the carpet bombing of Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, in 1995, 20,000 people killed in 5 weeks. They've not even tried to do something about the country's rampant alcoholism, which is destroying the social fabric. In fact, not only that, they even sell the alcohol. But when it comes to the gay issue, they found something that they feel that they can be indignant about. And on that issue, they use words like satanic, depraved, and so on and so forth. Now, it's not my purpose here to get into a discussion of that particular issue, but rather to point out that it's a diversionary maneuver, that in fact the question of the status of gays in Russia is not a big issue, because gays there, generally speaking, are afraid to advertise their orientation. And generally speaking, it's not very visible in Russian society. But it is visible in the West, and this gives Putin and the Russian Orthodox Church something that they can use to say that we are actually morally superior to the West. Forget about all the other things that we do. And unfortunately, there are many people in the West, or not many people, there's some people in the West who are gullible enough to swallow this.
Yes. Thank you for the speech. It was wonderful. I thought I saw on Reddit that a lot of the troops were called back to their barracks within the last couple of days. Is that another diversionary thing, or do you think there's a response to the pressure from the economic side that Putin's dealing with?
It's hard to say. We don't really know what motivates the Russian leadership because it's in a very opaque process. But you can't keep troops mobilized forever. And the fact that they've been pulled back doesn't mean that they won't be redeployed. And even if they've been pulled back, it doesn't mean that the fighting is going to stop or that the collection of quote-unquote volunteers, in fact, they emptied the prisons, and contractors in eastern Ukraine who are Russian citizens are going to stop fighting. I mean, the fighting continues, particularly around the Donetsk airport. The confrontation continues. There's still territory that's held. Officially, there's a ceasefire, but 300 people have been killed during the so-called ceasefire. So I would say that it doesn't mean a lot. Yes, it has happened. You're right. It doesn't mean that the crisis is over. It doesn't mean, and it certainly doesn't mean that the Russian government has given up the effort to destabilize Ukraine and prevent Ukraine from pursuing a Western path of development.
David, as you know, I'm over here.
I'm looking for you, but
I'm on to your right.
To my right.
Yes.
Oh, there you are.
Yeah, right.
Wonderful.
Yeah. As you know, I was at Hoover last year and was next door to John Dunlop and upstairs from Paul Gregory. And when all these things happened, we talked every day about it. And one of the things that they agreed on was that Putin, once he made these moves, could not stop. And the reason they argued was that the economy in Russia was stagnant, and it was going to get worse after the seizure of Ukraine because there was going to be nervousness in the capital markets and a withdrawal of support, which means that the economy would get worse, and that Putin would derive his legitimacy from conquest, from expansion. And their argument was he simply couldn't stop, which meant that it would go to the Baltics. Do you think that's right?
Well, I don't, even from a distance, I don't like to disagree with my friends John Dunlop and Paul Gregory. So you put me in a difficult spot. I think that the Baltics would be a tougher nut to crack for the simple reason that these are NATO members. I think that there are other candidates besides the Baltics, Moldova, Ukraine itself, Kazakhstan. This is all in the realm of speculation, of course. They will do whatever they think is in the interest of their survival. By this I mean the Putin regime. And if the economic sanctions are sufficiently destabilizing, they could make concessions, even in the case of Ukraine, in order to rid themselves of those sanctions. On the other hand, ridding themselves of those sanctions may come at the price of alienating the extreme nationalists who've now been unleashed in Russia. So I would not be as categorical about it. I think that they will do whatever they think is in their interest, and what's in their interest will depend on a very unpredictable and evolving set of circumstances.
We have time for one final question.
A person that I know that has contact with Russia once said very recently that the only patriotic Russian is a drunk Russian. What is the state of patriotism in Russia among common people?
Well, I don't know who said that, but I don't agree with that. The Russians are patriotic, and unfortunately their patriotism has been exploited and misused. Another factor, though, is that to a certain extent the suppression of individuals, the lack of individual rights, is compensated in the minds of Russians by the greatness of their state. The French writer, the Marquis de Custine, in the 19th century, writing about Russia, said, "The slave on his knees dreams of world domination." And when I was in the Soviet Union, I remember standing in lines at in the grocery stores, and what they call the gastronomes, and there would be long lines as people would wait to buy food. And I remember once someone said, he says, "How long can this go on, standing in these lines?" And a woman turned to him and said, "Don't worry, the whole world is afraid of us." And there is widespread patriotism. It's not confined to drunks. But although people become more patriotic the more they've had to drink. But it's also a reflection of the idea, and the very unhealthy idea, that, well, yeah, it's okay that we don't have full liberty as individuals, but look at our powerful state. And that attitude is indeed very widespread. Thank you.